Omuuonge Uozombuze.
Amaba hoasa.
Moving on with our afternoon session. Earlier in the day, Gwen engaged Paul McNally on podcasting as a sustainability tool, advocacy tool, or as a training tool. Now we have the opportunity to learn how to actually do it. And I therefore invite Paul, who is the director at Volume, to show us the how of podcasting. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's really great to be back here. I think we are going to go into the stages of how to make your own podcast, but I think we should also start with why you want to make your own podcast. I think that's like kind of a crucial question to ask yourself, because I think in this stage when podcasts are, the new shiny thing, a lot of people are producing podcasts, but they're not necessarily addressing why they want to do it. And I think that what's misguided is just to do it because everyone else is doing it and you want to kind of occupy that space in the same way, because it's quite chaotic out there in terms of getting your podcast heard and be able to kind of actually get some real estate on that, on people's ears. I think is kind of difficult. So you want to ask yourself, why do you want to make this podcast? And I think if you're an organization, especially say if you're a small newsroom, I think what is exciting is about like how you can promote your work in a completely different platform. And I think that's what's something which is really interesting. So you can kind of push your agenda of what you're reporting on or what stories you're producing, and say they go out on print, you can now think about a way to kind of produce those in an audio way. And, you could look around and you can see that certain newsrooms have more success with this than others. I think what is important is kind of is figuring out what resources you have at the start and making a plan in terms of what kind of podcast you want to do. Listen to a lot of podcasts, especially ones from other newsrooms, like listen to as much as you possibly can. And don't be afraid to kind of, beg, borrow, and steal ideas from other podcasts. Because I think, especially if you're producing something on a budget, then you're going to want to adapt what you're listening to and kind of like pick the best bits from several different kinds of podcasts and then kind of reproduce them as your own. So I think that, let's take an assumption that you're a small newsroom and you want to produce a podcast around your work. I think that that's kind of one of the most popular things that we're seeing as a trend. So if you're an NGO, you might want to produce something around your organization's advocacy. You might want to produce something like that. Or if you're a small like investigative unit, you might want to make your investigations that are like long 2,000 word articles, you might want to produce those as a podcast series. You might want to create something that's got several episodes and that people can follow through the investigation. So let's take that as an assumption and think about what you first got to do is take that like enthusiasm and that interest that you have for your own organization and kind of put that into an original idea or have an original source of information. So I think what happens is what's quite misguided is people start a podcast just around their organization or around their newsroom. And unless you're a big newsroom with a huge brand behind you, which can work, say if you're like an ENCA or, a BBC or CNN, then people will just gravitate you to you because they're aware of your brand and the strength of that. But if you're not, then I think you're going to have to think a little bit harder around what you're actually offering people in terms of their editorial diet, right? So you're competing with not just radio, you're also competing with all these other podcasts, you're competing with Netflix and television and YouTube, and you have to kind of see it in that way. Apart from your core group of followers that you'll have that will kind of follow you anywhere and might be reading your site, you want to kind of expand that audience. And to do that, I think you can kind of offer something that's a bit more niche. And it seems counterproductive, right? That idea of making something niche to hit a broader market, but that's kind of how podcasting works. Like if you manage to produce something that isn't just about my organization, but if you produce something that's like we did, Winston is actually on the call, and I saw that he was speaking earlier, and we did a podcast with him for CCIJ, and we did a very interesting podcast called two podcasts, one with him and one with someone else, one called Waterless and one called Transparency Talks. And they were for the CCIJ. And what Waterless did, which was interesting, was it honed down the reporting of certain journalists, and it made it just about water issues. So that's just one example of how you can kind of narrow something down and make it specific. So I would try and think around either, like I said, an original idea or an original source of information. So if you have an investigation where it's kind of reaped a lot of data or sources or information that people haven't had access to, then I think you could base a podcast around that. Otherwise, you kind of have something around like, we're just going to do stories on water, for example, or we're just going to do stories on whistleblowing, or we're just going to do misinformation. And I think the more you can kind of hone that down, even though your newsroom might produce news on everything, if you kind of just go, right, we're just going to do a sports podcast, I think that you can have real traction there, especially if you kind of look at what else is in the market in your country. So I think that's the second thing when you're first starting out is if you can go into a market and try and compete, but what's much easier is to do something which no one else is doing. So if you could kind of look around and see like, okay, well, everyone is doing a podcast around sports, then I don't think there's much, and maybe soccer dedicated magazines that are doing that, then you as a newsroom, maybe you're not going to get much traction on that. But, you might be the only people that are really looking into assassinations, for example, and you could do like a very specific podcast on assassinations and really get some traction there and be known as the podcast about assassinations. And I think there's some kind of real value in there. Okay, so then after you've kind of established your idea and kind of where you're going from your organization, so it's coming, and I as a tip here, I would say that what you want to do is you want to kind of utilize as many resources as you are already using in your newsroom. So you're going to get like a host, could get someone who's in your newsroom. If you're going to do a big investigation story, do one that's already going. I think depending on how much money you have, really. But I think to kind of reproduce something in a podcast format, if this is your first podcast, is not the worst way to go. Obviously someone might come to you who's very enthusiastic in your office or newsroom and just be like, I want to do this as a purely podcasting project. And they might take that and run with it. And that's very exciting if someone does that, because original investigations in podcasts are kind of picking up steam. But if you're just looking to kind of dip your toe into the water as an organization, then I would say, try and utilize what you've got going on already and push that into your podcasting project. Okay, so the format is what you're going to want to think about. Now, you can think about, like I said earlier, there are long podcasts, so you don't have to be worried about short length, but it needs to justify, the format needs to justify what you're doing. So you can have long interview podcast, but then you better make sure that your interviewer is really on the ball and kind of got a bit of a high profile. Like those kind of podcasts that have 3-hour interviews, they're not just rambling along. They're kind of like someone who really knows their stuff. They're well researched, and they're also someone that has a following already. So we can kind of assume that as a newsroom, you're probably not going to do that straight away. But like, I'm going to put out some names now. Like if you look at the ProPublica podcast, they just do straight interviews with their journalists, right? So they don't really do much editing. So if you've written an investigation, then you come on the podcast and you kind of talk about your investigation. One of the most famous ones is the New York Times, is the Daily, and they are and that kind of covers a story that has already appeared in the Times, but they're going to in depth once a day. And I think that's something, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the Daily, because at that time, it's been a couple of years now, but at that time people were doing like scattered newscasts, like just a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of this. And the Daily was like, let's just do one story a day. We're assumed that that's not the only news you're taking in. You're reading the New York Times, you're a subscriber, there was all these kinds of assumptions, even though you don't have to be a subscriber to get the podcast. But the idea was that we're going to do something a little bit more in depth. And I think that's the advantage of podcasting that you can kind of do. You can do something accessible, which also is a little bit more in depth, and you can kind of dig into it a little bit deeper. So what I would suggest is that for formats, you want to take something like, and a format that we like to use quite a lot is you take something like just interviews, and you don't do it as a straight interview, but you cut out the interviewer and you just use narration around the interviews. So, you know, just sort of a basic documentary kind of style. It takes quite a bit more effort than a straight interview, but you get a lot more versatility. You get a lot more ability to jump over and explain complicated concepts through voiceover in a lot more of an easy way. And I would really recommend this kind of format. So we've done, we actually released an episode today called Media Diaries. And through that, we take in voice notes from people, and we narrate around the voice notes and make a package around that. So instead of just like interviewing people and keeping the interviewer in, we script the whole episode, and then we voice note and we voice over around it. And I think that there is something in that. If it's a voice note or if it's an interview, I think what you should really take advantage of is the fact that you're not live, right? So you don't have to do a live podcast, like recorded live. You can basically have the opportunity to listen through to things, to editorialize, to add extra information. Because I mean, when you interview someone, as we all know, is that people often say things that need explanation, right? So, and it can be quite tedious to do that in an interview format. So what you can do is then you can add in the voiceover that will give the background and the information that people need. So I think that's the kind of format I would really recommend. Something like The Daily, something like the Media Diaries that Volume produces, something that kind of builds and scripts around interviews. And that's something that I think is kind of in the middle of effort. So it's not a case of, you know, if you think of podcasts like This American Life or Radio Lab, those things are very intensely produced. So that's a lot of outside sound. It's a lot of external interviews. It's like sounds of cars going by when you're talking about a street, you know, and I would, you know, I'm a big believer in that kind of podcasting, but I wouldn't recommend it as your first podcast. I would say that, like, you know, you kind of want to, the work should be in the writing. You don't want to kind of overextend yourself in terms of the production. But saying that, you do need to still collect tape. So then that's in the form of interviews. If it's in the form of WhatsApp voice notes, you want to kind of collect as much tape as possible. And hopefully you have, either you do it yourself or you have someone that can transcribe those recordings and put them into use. So that's kind of really what you want to be able to do. And, you know, for your first podcast, you want to be able to be thinking all the time around what will make good audio. And, you know, people often say, like, if it doesn't happen on tape, then it didn't happen at all. And I think that that's something that's like a really important point, in that you want to be able to collect as much as possible. And even if it's just a straight interview, you've all heard it on a podcast where it's them just setting up the microphones or setting up the equipment. That can add texture to a podcast, which can be really interesting beyond just like straight studio chat. So you're always looking for these little bits of humanity, you know. And I think that's an important thing that maybe mainstream radio has tried to scrub away, but like podcast really leans into, is this idea of people feeling very human, people feeling like, you know, maybe you leave in a few more of the ums and ahs and mistakes, because that can kind of make someone, if it's warranted, can make someone feel a little bit more personable. So once you've collected as much tape as possible, you then got to move into the writing phase. And I would say like 60% of your work is in the writing, right? It really is like podcast. I mean, some people have often said like, oh, I got into broadcasting, I got into radio or podcasting because I didn't like writing. And you're like, you shouldn't be in podcasting, because like the majority of the work is in writing. And it's not just writing like a print piece, but it's writing to audio. So you want to use descriptions. Even if you're just doing a straight interview with someone and you do that voiceover that I spoke about, you want to describe the person, like what they're wearing, what they look like, what they're doing. You know, you want to kind of give as much energy and like juice for the listener as possible, because that's what you're hungering for as a listener. And I think it's kind of, you got to identify with that, is that you're trying to form a picture in your mind at all times when you're just listening to audio. You don't have the advantages of having pictures. So you need to help these people out. And when a good descriptive line like lands in a podcast, it can be really like magical for the listener. And I think you want to try and do that as much as possible. You want to be able to, but what's important is also to script around the information that you've collected. So if this is detail or if it's extra like investigative detail, you want to put that all into your script, but you also want to make sure that your scripting breaks up the sound bites as much as possible. So what you can also, in order to help the listener, they don't want to listen to the same voice for too much of a long extended period. So you can kind of break up those sound bites and put in your writing as much as possible, put in your voiceover as much as possible, even if it's to condense a whole paragraph. Sometimes someone you interview can be very long-winded and they can be rambling on, and you can kind of condense that into one line and really shorten it. And people, will appreciate that. Like, they don't want to necessarily listen to rambling interview when you can just condense it into a one line of voiceover. So I think the writing is really important, like pulling people along a story. So the way someone described, this isn't my insight, but someone described writing for radio to me is that you're always posing questions and then you're answering them. And I think that that's something that's really important. Like, you're kind of giving a sense of like, what does this person want? Like, say, a character or someone who's going through a story. How are they going to get out of this problem? How are they going to solve this problem? And you're posing these questions, and then you let some action happen in between there, and then you're answering that question. And if you think about it, that's what really kind of moves you through a story. It's kind of creates intrigue. Like, you always want to have like a question, like, why is a place quiet? Why is someone limping? Why is this happening? You can set up tiny little things that trigger a question in someone's mind, and then that will keep them listening for a little bit, and then you can answer that question. Then you can set up another one, and that will keep them pulled along. Because ultimately, the thing about radio and podcasting in general is that you can lose someone and then they are gone, right? So if people are listening to a linear story, like an in-depth investigation on a podcast, and you lose it, and they kind of lose interest for a couple of minutes, they're probably not coming back, because they don't know where they are. They're probably not going to go back in their podcasting app to figure out where they were. So and often you've got to, like we spoke about earlier, people are doing things while they're listening to this podcast. So simultaneously you've got to deliver a huge amount of information, but you also have to do it in a way that allows someone not to get lost. And I think that's the key to the writing part of it. And it's also like not something you always get right? You're kind of trying to balance, you're trying to put information across as succinctly as possible and as clearly as possible. You don't want to repeat yourself too much, because people will get bored. In the first few podcasts I did, people criticized me and said that I just explained everything and was repeating everything, because I was so frightened that someone would get lost in all the information. So it's not something that's easy, but it is something that can be done with other people listening to your work. And I think that's the kind of key that you need to kind of think about, is when you're embarking on a podcasting project for your newsroom, you can think about like, this is the producer, but you've also got to be open to the fact that like a bunch of people should be listening to this at different stages of the process, because that's the only way you figure out the places where people get lost. Very experienced podcast producers can still take incredible amounts of constructive criticism in terms of like, this doesn't make sense, this part of the story, I'm completely lost here. You need to explain this for an international audience, because that's also the other thing, is that with podcasting, with a lot of our podcasts, our audiences are split between international and local, quite almost 50-50 in some ways. So you've got to, if it's either translating certain words that people say in different languages, or if it's doing currency conversions on your local currency, these are the little things that people can get like tripped up on. And they're kind of, and then if you imagine it, they're listening and they're thinking like, how much is that in dollars? How much is that in dollars? And then they're already not listening to you, and you're already losing them. So those are the things you've got to be thinking about, is that the fact how linear everything is, and how, even though that's fantastic to keep people's attention rather than a print piece, if you lose them, then they are lost. And you need to be always encouraging and always repeating, but not too much, in order to keep people interested. And I think that's the sort of fascination with producing audio, is that like playing with that attention. And that's the kind of, that's kind of true for all journalism, really, in some ways, is that you are hankering for people's attention and you want to keep it as much as possible. But I don't feel that you get as much of a tactile sense of it as you do with writing and producing for audio. So, and I think the last thing I just want to say about writing is that you need to think in scenes. That's the key, right? So going back to that point of people imagining what's happening at all points, like if you manage to, you need to be like, we're going to a doctor's office, right? And you get sound of the doctor's office and you speak to a doctor there. And in this scene of going to the doctor's office, for example, you can kind of unload as much information about medical practices and about, or whatever the story is about, in terms of involving the doctor and the medical profession in the scene. The thing is once things starts to drop outside of your scenes, people get really lost. And they're like, well, why are you talking about that now? But they're like, oh, of course you should talk about this now. We're visiting the doctor. I mean, that seems like maybe too much of an obvious point, but when I almost storyboard my podcast in scenes. So I go like, this is going to be the first scene. We're going to visit this person and we're going to talk about this. This is going to be the point of the scene. Next scene, we go over here and you can maybe hear some driving, and here I am driving to this next person, and here I am saying hello to this person. And now we're talking about this. You know, even though you might not have got all that information from that person, through voiceover and through writing techniques, you can unload that information into that scene. And if you manage to fit, this is the key, like sort of challenge, is if you can fit everything into scenes, then people are way more likely to be following with you, because they're imagining it like a movie, right? They're imagining you going there, they're imagining you doing this, and in their open, you know, people always said like once your once your mouth is open with either aghast or joy, then you can just feed them information. And I think that's sort of similar with audio. If you just start hammering figures and information at people, especially in a podcast, people can get lost really fast. Like that's the problem with a lot of things, is if you have like graphs and figures and things like that to try and get across, you can get really lost in it. So I would recommend that you try and think in scenes, and think in terms of a beginning, middle, and end to your story. This is if you're telling like some sort of like if you think about it as like a print feature, if you're telling something like that in audio, then I think you can really harness that and kind of have some kind of resolution and some kind of beginning. But as long as you've got that scene structure, you'll be okay. Okay, so now I want to move into editing. So you've created this script, you've got all this tape, and now I think one of the most intimidating parts for people who are starting a new podcast can be the editing process. So people can really get like stuck on this. And I think there's a free program called Audacity, which is great. I'll put it in the chat at the end. And you can download that. It's for Mac and for PC, and you can do the edit. You can do pretty much all the editing on there. It's not the greatest program, but it's for the fact that it's free, and some of these other programs cost an absolute fortune, then I think that you can definitely start with that. And there's plenty of tutorials on YouTube around that. I mean, I can't teach you how to edit just over this call, but I would, as a tip, I would encourage you to download a program like Audacity and just play around with it as much as possible. Because I mean, I was mostly self-taught around the editing side of things. I had a lot of great mentors around the writing and the audio collection and the reporting. But when it came to editing, I was largely self-taught. And I don't think I'm the fastest editor, but at the same time, like, you don't have to be. You can just the more you kind of play around with the clips and you think about the rhythm of what the story you want to tell. And I can't stress this enough in terms of what makes a good podcast to a great podcast is that rhythm. And it's almost like hard to teach, but I think you just pick it up by constantly editing. Is that then you get a sense of like, this clip should end here, this person should stop speaking here, there should be voiceover here, and you get a real feeling for it, because you've got to trust your own sense of boredom. You've got to really kind of be hard on yourself and be like, would I be bored by this now? And that's kind of the question that I ask myself when I'm editing all the time, like, is this just boring? And it's kind of like, it's hard because you've done the interview probably and you've collected the tape and you are invested in the story and you don't find any of it boring, but you need to kind of like look out of yourself and go like, is this boring? Am I boring my listener? And if you are, then you can, this is your chance. Your editing operation is your chance to edit something and kind of really make a change there. But as I say, that it's very difficult to teach editing like over a Zoom call, but I would say download the program and just play around with it as much as possible. And the next thing I wanted to come to is voicing. So you're going to voice this voiceover that's going to guide people through your story. Now, I'm in a recording booth right now that we use here at Volume, and it's great. But you can also use your car. That's like a tip that we often give people, is that you can record on your phone in a car in a garage. That works really well. A car is an incredibly insulated place. And we have some people that record their voiceover like that. There's a number of other programs like Zencaster and Squadcast, where you can do internet calls, which are kind of like Skype calls, but then you record it over there and the quality is slightly better than a Skype or a Zoom call. I'll put those links in the chat as well. So it's Zencaster and Squadcast. So that's also another way, especially in these Corona times where you don't have access to a recording booth. It's like kind of like you give someone a link and they phone them up, and then you can record their part of the conversation and yours. So the quality is pretty good on that. The one tip I would just give about voicing is that you've got to try and be yourself as much as possible, but not too much of yourself. Because what someone described to me is that you're essentially playing a part, like as if you're acting, but the part that you're playing is yourself. And I think that that's the best description that you can give to someone who can, who's trying to do voiceover, is they need to be a little bit more enthusiastic, a little bit more emotional, a little bit more like farcical in that way, a bit more shocked if they feel shocked. You've got to be able to sense their emotion because you can't see their face. But at the same time, you don't want them to be on the one side, like completely monotone, serious BBC news voice, and you don't want them to be like hysterical, almost to the point of like distraction. So it takes a lot of effort. Like it takes a lot of practice to just, and everyone hates the sound of their own voice when they first start. So if you are going to bring in a host from someone in your office, then make sure it's someone that actually has some kind of inclination to want to do it. We've just spoken to someone this morning about a podcast, and they have someone in their HR department who really wants to get into voice acting, and we're like, we'll take that person, because to get over that hump of someone who hates the sound of their own voice and really doesn't want to do it at all is quite difficult. But if someone's a little bit over the hump, then they can be trained pretty quickly. And I can't stress enough how much you just have to be yourself. Like you, and also you're the conduit for the story. So people need to feel the emotions. They need to feel what's happening through you. So that's also important. So you need to express the emotion that you want your listener to feel, because that's how they're going to know what to feel, is through you as the host. Lastly, last two things is, first of all, hosting like on different platforms. Like we use, and this is largely about preference and price. So when I say hosting, that's where you upload your podcast to. And then essentially things like Spotify and iTunes, you don't upload your podcast to there. They are directories. So they're kind of like the phone book of podcasts, right? So you submit the URL once it's uploaded to iTunes, and then they catalog it on their directory. Same with Spotify, but you don't upload it there. You have to pay for a different person to host it. So we use Iono in South Africa. We also use another one which is based in the States called Captivate for some of our podcasts. And there's so many out there, and it's really a matter of preference. But I would recommend Captivate if you can. Captivate.fm. They're very reasonably priced, and they kind of work very well. And they kind of have like inbuilt players that you can use, and they have automatic updates, so you can send it to iTunes and Spotify, because it's getting on those directories of Spotify and iTunes that you really have to do to be able to get people to see or listen to your podcast. And then lastly, kind of on this, is I just wanted to go into the marketing of it, is that you want to be able to get people to listening to it and finding it where they find their podcast. So this would be on Apple Podcasts, this would be on Spotify. And the way to kind of do that is that to get people to write about it. So you can submit, if you can see bloggers that write these lists around podcasts, submit them to that, like podnews.net is a good one. You can kind of, also you can write, if you send an email to your local Apple marketer, like the person who's the head of marketing at Apple in your country, they often will be able to put you in contact with the person who controls the programming on iTunes, and you can perhaps get your podcast features there. That's a really helpful tip. And you can put it on like that. So that's, I know it's very, it's a lot of information to take in a short space of time, but you can contact me on, I'll put my email address here, and you can email me any questions that you have, and I'll be happy to talk more.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Paul. That was amazing. You took us from the why you want to do your own podcast up to the point of marketing. And I think that's amazing. So you kind of took us through. For someone who has never done it before, you've provided that glimpse already that would help us to start off. And I just wanted to remind everyone that, remember, it's not just for journalists who are practicing journalism, but remember the reasons, or earlier on in this earlier session where it was highlighted that you can do podcasting for sustainability purposes, where you can actually be making money out of it, and make sure that you're sustaining your business in the media sector. But also you can do it for advocacy. Select a particular cause that you would want to champion and do a podcast around that particular issue. And yes, you can also do it for training purposes. So those in academics, you can actually use this as a tool to reach out to your students, even run particular courses through the podcast. And if you look back in the COVID days, for my colleagues in Malawi, where we couldn't do any physical learning, podcasting would come handy. So all the reasons, if you're in academics, in the media, or in advocacy, you can use podcasting as a tool. So thanks so much, Paul. We won't be able to take questions right now, but I'm really glad that you've provided us with your email address, and we can reach out to you if we have any questions or we will need any clarifications. But yeah, Stephanie has a question, maybe a quick one. We just take this one, Paul, if you may.
Sure.
Yes, please. Stephanie, would you want to ask your question?
Right, I can do quickly.
Yes. Yes,
Hi, Paul. Thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. A quick question with regard to your audience. Could you tell us who's your audience and has it changed? So were you able to attract more people, different age groups, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because it's something that we're trying to bring in different audiences for different podcasts. So like our investigative podcasts have an audience that's largely international, but when we produce things that like we produce certain podcasts like our Powder podcast and Whistleblower podcast, they have audiences that are mostly based in South Africa. So it is something that it's changing all the time, and it's something that we're thinking about as much as possible. But at the same time, we have to be conscious of, like, each podcast has its own audience and it has to build separately. And that's part of the challenge. So we're trying to cross-pollinate our podcast as much as possible and bring people in who, like, if you've listened to this one, maybe you'll like this other one. We're trying to do that. But, by design, podcasts kind of operate as separate channels, which is part of the joy of it, but it's also part of the challenge.
But again, thanks so much, Paul, and thanks so much to Simon. He has been posting the links as you were going through your presentation, and those are helpful as well. If you'd want to add any other links, please feel free, Paul, to post them to the chat.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Omuuonge Uozombuze.
Amaba.